Okay, let's continue with our environmental issues lecture, and keep in mind, as with all the issues in this class, I can't possibly cover everything that's going to come up, and I can't go into detail with all the problems that you might hear from time to time from the news media, etc. But so we need to have a proper view of the environment in order to be able to understand the issues and not overreact to the issues and so forth. So that's the foundation, is having a proper view of the environment. You're going to see all kinds of fun stuff, get on the internet, all kinds of images. This image, of course, has the idea of the earth being in our control and so forth. Let's go back to where we always should go, and that is to the Bible. What is the role of man in the environment according to God? What is a proper view of the environment according to God, according to the Bible? We looked at Psalms chapter 8 a little bit last time. Here's the last section, 6 through 8. I think we looked at 3 through 8 before. And remember, we know that God has given man dominion over the environment. So who remembers the proper view of the environment? Two ideas. God created and controls it, and what's the second part? Which is what this verse is dealing with. He determines man's role in it, okay? Not the government, and so forth. All right, so you can see that God has put the animal kingdom in particular under man's feet. Goes into detail: sheep and oxen, yea, the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. We're going to review a little bit about pollution, review a little bit about resource depletion, and then mostly talk about species extinction and biodiversity and other things that you might hear. So there's our biblical view of the environment. Both aspects are important. God created it, He controls it, and He determines our place in it. So that is the proper view of the environment. So no matter what issue comes up, climate change, global warming, ice age, whatever may come down the pike next, if we have a proper view of the environment, it's not going to make that much difference to us. And remember, what is the key word in dealing with a biblical viewpoint? What should be the key word in everything you do? Yes? Stewardship. Okay. And so we have to be aware of stewardship versus environmentalism. Okay. We have to approach, we live in the world around us. Our culture is more and more materialistic, but at the same time even pantheistic. At any rate, it's anti-God and anti-Bible. So we have to avoid environmentalism. I mean, you might hear someone say, well, you're a Christian, you should be concerned with the environment. Or you should be concerned with all these different things. Well, that's true. But the problem is environmentalism is extreme. It's off balance and so forth. So that doesn't mean, though, that we should exploit the environment and be completely careless with what God has given us. And, of course, we want to view the environment as if it were God's. Why? Because it is. Okay? And there's those three ideas again: conservation, responsibility, innovation. All right? And that's opposed to three inappropriate, what I feel are inappropriate solutions we'll be talking about later. I think our biblical view of the environment, we should be conservative. We should be responsible, and we should seek better technology that does use energy more efficient, better technology that does cut down on pollution, better technology that does use more renewable forms of energy. There's nothing wrong with those things. The problem is environmentalism is off balance. So conservation, responsibility, and innovation versus the three main solutions proposed by humanistic environmentalists is the idea of population control, okay, control of consumption, and then regulation of industry. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we still have to keep in mind stewardship versus the environment, and we have to avoid environmentalistic ideas because they are not godly, they are not biblical, they are pantheistic. And the more you look at environmental websites and so forth, the more pantheism you're going to see. okay, where the nature is first personified, remember, Mother Nature, and then it becomes even deified. That's very pantheistic, but also it can be very political. So it's just not a pantheistic view, it can also be a very materialistic view. Either one, kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, either one is incorrect. There's politics involved, of course, more and more. And of course, that the politics of environmentalism changes with different administrations and so forth. But it is a means of taking away control, liberty, and even control of industry. All right, so environmental problems, are they real? What's the answer to that question? Yes or no? Well, yes, of course there are. But what is the true picture? I think we do have environmental problems. There are pollution issues, especially in different countries and so forth, but they're specific to particular ecosystems. They are not global. They are more local. So they're not on a global scale. We're not facing so-called planetary crises, all right? And they're local problems with local solutions. They're not this crisis that we need to get government intervention involved. It's not where we need these big global conventions and so forth to try to correct global problems. So remember, environmental issues are not global. We are going to talk about global warming or climate change or whatever you want to call it. There's no such thing as global warming. All right, climate is not global. Climate is local. Okay, the climate of the Earth is too dynamic, too varied, too diverse to be considered as one climate. Environmental issues are not dire, no matter what you see or hear. There's problems, yes, and in some places they're very severe, but they're not globally dire, okay? It's not a crisis. We don't need to be eco-justice. Yes?
I just read that in Colorado there was a snowstorm that they had to cancel a global warming rally because of the snowstorm.
Well, that's good. I'm not that old, but it's just kind of the flavor of the day. That's why they keep changing the name of it. So it was global warming, but that's simply really not happening. In the 70s when I grew up, it was all coming ice age, which we'll talk about this in the next lecture. And then the other idea is that the Earth itself is not in our hands. Whose hands is it in? God's hands, okay? And that's what the whole problem is, that we've gotten away from God. We don't have a biblical worldview, so we think there's all these dire things that we need to be involved in, which are not important. So, environmental issues are not global, they're not dire, and they're not really in our hands anyways. And they certainly are sensationalized and so forth. And remember, God created the earth, and He knew what the population would be in 2017, didn't He? And He has given the earth enough resilience in itself that we don't need to be worried about global catastrophes and so forth. So every time, don't believe what you read and hear a lot of times, especially from our liberal news media with their own agenda, and from the entertainment industry, and certainly not from public education. And then the earth, of course, is more resilient than we give it credit for. We do not need to take drastic measures. But that doesn't mean that we don't go back to those three ideas. That doesn't mean we don't conserve. That doesn't mean we're not responsible for how we treat the environment. That doesn't mean we can wantonly pollute and so forth. But it's been sensationalized, and we don't need to take drastic measures. And here again, I showed you this quote before. This is the typical propaganda coming out of the news media, found on the internet and so forth. They keep constantly referring to the planet being on the brink of something, or on the brink of global catastrophe, We're on the brink of a mass extinction, on and on it goes. So when you hear things talking about the earth as a whole, you need to suspect it. When you see things talking about this huge crisis that we have to take drastic measures for, you need to suspect it, okay? Because more than likely it is overstated, overemphasized, and it even may be on somebody's political agenda. So you can see the wording, planetary emergency. You see things like that, you need to suspect it. Are there environmental issues? Sure there are. We talked about pollution. We're going to talk about resource depletion and then species extinction again today. So there are three main environmental concerns. Sounds like a quiz question because it probably will be. All right, what are the three main environmental concerns? Is there pollution? Are these concerns real? Of course they are. We do have pollution issues, but are they global? No. Are they dire? No. Do we need to take drastic measures to avert a planetary emergency? No. So we do have pollution problems. Remember, all areas of the biosphere can be subject to pollution, whether it's air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, even soil pollution. Of the three, which one is the most concern? Because it's difficult to control and it spreads. Which one? Air pollution, yes. So should we be concerned about air pollution? To a point. And also it might even depend on where you live. Should you be concerned about air pollution? Resource depletion. We're also going to deal with three. We began last time with water. We're going to continue on today with oil and other fossil fuels, and then forests. Species extinction. All right. According to environmentalists, we're on the brink of a sixth extinction, parallel to the fifth extinction. Who remembers what the fifth extinction was? Yes?
Dinosaurs.
The dinosaurs, 65 million years ago. And that's the asteroid fantasy. All right. What is pollution? You should have this definition. I'm reviewing, which means I'm interested in you knowing what do we mean when we say pollution. That is anything that is added to the environment that has an undesirable or even harmful effect on the ecosystem. Not on the globe, but on the ecosystem. There are man-made types of pollution, obviously, but there's even natural types of pollution. Global warming extremists also have a problem with cattle and ranchers because cattle give off methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So they're not just industrial sources of pollution, even man-made sources of pollution. But of course it's our fault that we have all these ranches because we're eating all this beef. Okay? And then of course we can have problems with air pollution, land pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. So that is pollution that we've already discussed. Now, resource depletion is when we are using up our natural resources faster than the earth can replenish them, and so forth. A lot of this deals with evolution. According to evolutionists, it takes millions of years for those fossil fuels to form, which is why they're called fossil fuels. All right? And so, of course, if God didn't create and God didn't supply resources, then there could be problems. So all of this a lot of it is based on an evolutionary worldview. We're going to deal with water. We already dealt with water. Today we're going to deal with oil and forests, the loss of the rainforests. There's the resource depletion involving water, and we have a lot of alarmist propaganda out about water being scarce and the fact we're going to have drinking water shortages, food shortages due to lack of irrigation and famine and so forth. Is there a problem with clean drinking water? Yes. Obviously not in the United States, but in parts of the world there is a serious problem with water shortages and the access to clean water. But it's not a global environmental emergency, okay? And there needs to be some things done locally in countries and so forth, with giving people better access, drilling deeper water wells, supplying things like that. But it's not an environmental crisis. Of course, we always have to have dramatic pictures. Now I want to talk about oil. Of course, from oil we get all kinds of products. Obviously, the most one that comes to mind first would be gasoline, but there's all kinds of other uses that we can manufacture from oil. Oil is a fossil fuel, along with coal and natural gas and so forth. And is there a limited amount of coal in the earth? Of course there is, but again, we don't give the earth enough credit for being resilient. We don't give God any credit for knowing ahead of time what was going to happen, dealing with God's providence. Causes of oil depletion, of course. Number one cause of most of the environmental issues that we're going to deal with, the number one cause that environmentalists bring up constantly is what? It's the top one there on the list. Increased population. A lot of them I've seen more than once, the increase of the Earth's population being referred to as a population bomb. Okay? Humans are just exploding in number. We have to do something about overpopulation, particularly in the third world countries. Okay? We all seen the result of population in control in China. Does anybody know the results of the population control policies in China? You know how they had an enforced one-child policy, right? What's the problem in China nowadays? Besides the fact of all the abortions that were done in China, besides the fact of all the abandoned baby girls, what happens in China? Why have they recently relaxed their population controls, their one-child policies? Anybody know? It's off kilter. Okay, so if you're a Chinese family and you want to carry on your name, which gender are you going to choose? Male gender. So what happens? There's not enough Chinese women, okay, because they enforce population controls. So there's all kinds of issues that we could talk about with population controls. Okay, population controls, especially the mandated one-child policy. What does that lead to? Abortion, infanticide, and all kinds of problems. And of course, industry. All right, in countries like ours, we don't really have a population boom per se, but what we do have is increased industrialization and urbanization. What do I mean by urbanization? What does that mean? It means concentration of people in large cities. Okay, and then those cities get bigger and bigger. That's referred to as urban sprawl. Consequences of oil depletion are primarily economic, population problems, smaller economies, lower standard of living, higher prices, and so forth. So resource depletion does involve fossil fuels, and here's where we're going to have push to use renewable energy. Renewable energy includes things like solar power, wind power, geothermal power, and things like that. There's nothing wrong with pursuing renewable energy, but using the fossil fuels, sometimes referred to as dirty energy as opposed to clean energy, there's nothing wrong with what we're doing with our using fossil fuels. Deforestation is the next problem, according to environmentalists. We are using up our forests. This is another example of resource depletion. I showed you this last lecture. Imagine a world without trees. Is that even remotely possible? No. It's alarmist, extremist, and so forth. It's to get your attention. So whenever you see statements like that, what should your thought be? You should suspect it. It's overstated. It's extremist. It's not going to happen. Causes of deforestation, of course, is increased agriculture and urbanization. So we're going back to the population bomb. We have to feed all of these 7.5 billion people on the earth. Of course, illegal logging and so forth. Consequences of deforestation. Is there a problem when we cut down large areas of forests? Yes, there can be, but that's going to be a local problem. It's not going to cause global warming. As you can see, consequences. Soil erosion, yes, we cut down the vegetation, the soil will erode, but that's a local issue. Global warming, okay. Deforestation, of course you know about photosynthesis. What do trees in particular do in the environment? With photosynthesis, the trees and other plants will take carbon dioxide out of the air, right, and give off oxygen. So forests do affect the carbon dioxide cycle, but it's not a planetary emergency. Loss of biodiversity, that's another phrase. We can't, we can't have any species going extinct because that's going to cause all these catastrophic results. And then flooding and drought. What about resource depletion? Is it a planetary emergency? Is it a crisis? As you are dealing with any environmental issue, are environmental concerns real? Yes. But what do you need to do when you're thinking about this or you hear about it? You need to realize the environmental bias of the news media and in educational institutions. Very environmental, very biased. Right, so as you are thinking about environmental issues and wondering what's the big deal, be aware that these issues will always have an extreme component. Realize that there is the environmentalist bias. Realize that these are promoted viewpoints with a political agenda. They're out of balance, they're alarmist and extreme. That doesn't mean there is no root problem, but what it does mean is it's overemphasized. It's out of balance. It's not a planetary emergency. Then remember the 4 tactics that we have talked about. Make sure you know them and can illustrate them, which we will do with global warming on Thursday. Then we have our final environmental lecture a week from today, and we will illustrate these 4 tactics. You need to know them, and you need to look out for them as you are thinking about different issues. What is the first tactic? Manipulation of data. Choosing which facts we're going to present. Choosing how we gather our facts. Choosing, if we're talking about species extinction, choosing which species we center in on. A lot of that. Even appealing to a scientific consensus. Everybody knows we're facing the 6th extinction. Scientists all agree. Are those true statements? Predict alarming results, many times with propaganda, manufactured images, and so forth. So we also blame the wrong causes. What is the number 1 cause? Okay, look around. You're looking at it. Humans, overpopulation, overconsumption, too much industry. It's all our fault. Okay? And because we blame the wrong causes, we're going to propose the wrong solutions. So as you're looking at environmental issues, you need to suspect what you read and hear, especially on the internet. And you need to be on the lookout for this environmental bias. you need to wonder, where did they get those statistics? How did they arrive at that conclusion? Did they manipulate their data? Are they overstating the consequences? What's the cause? What's the solution? And so forth. So be aware of those 4 tactics. So we're talking about resource depletion. Is there going to be dire consequences involved with a scarcity of water or a scarcity of oil and other fossil fuels? Or is there going to be a planetary emergency with respect to deforestation? All right, what's going to happen if we cut down all our forests? Are we going to cut down all our forests? No. Okay? And a lot of these issues are simply out of our control, even out of our control as Americans, because we're going to have deforestation in parts of South America. Okay? We have no control over that. We'll be dealing with species extinction in just a minute. What species are the most endangered? And why are they the most endangered? A lot of them, of course, are going to be African species and so forth, and Chinese, Asian species. And a lot of that is due to illegal poaching. And a lot of those things are already being dealt with, okay? And they're out of our control anyways. So what about resource depletion? And again, as we are dealing with environmental issues, how can we view all this problem with there's going to be scarcity of water? Oh, we're going to use up our fossil fuels. Oh, we're cutting down forests at an alarming rate. What do we have to keep in mind? We have to keep in mind and understand God's sovereignty. Do you have a biblical worldview or do you not? Okay? If you have a biblical worldview, you're going to believe in God's sovereignty. And so when we take God's sovereignty out of the picture, then we are going to have all these issues that we're afraid of. The world is going to end. Okay? So make sure you understand God's sovereignty with respect to the environment. What do we say a biblical view of the environment entails? It entails the fact that God still maintains direct control over the environment. Does God know what's going on? Of course he does. All right, so that's environmental issues are not something we need to be spending a lot of time with, are they? There are much more important things for Christians to be dealing with. Also, if you believe in God's sovereignty and you have a biblical view of the environment, you know that God supplied the earth with enough resources to sustain man. God knows what he's doing. Do you think God didn't know the nature of man and how man's going to be greedy? Man's going to tend to exploit the environment and so forth. God knows. God knows what's going to happen. We may not know. We may not understand with what's going to happen in the future. But the other thing here, we have God designed the earth with its own recycling processes. You probably remember from especially junior high science, learning the water cycle, learning the nitrogen cycle, learning the rock cycle. So God has designed the earth with its own recycling processes that we can reuse and renew. The earth does renew and reuse its resources. And of course, if we understand God's sovereignty, we know that the earth will end how and when God decides that it will. We all believe in the second coming of Christ, I hope. And so we're not going to worry about the earth ending in some environmental crisis. There's other ways we need to prepare for the end of the earth, isn't there? Not dealing with some planetary crisis. And of course, we have the promise of God from Genesis chapter 8. What's going on around Genesis 8, 9, 10, 11? What's going on in the Bible? What's the context of Genesis 8? What's about to happen? Yes? Pardon me? The flood. Okay. And what does God say? The environment is going to continue, right? While the earth remaineth. Who's going to decide when the earth no longer remains? It's not us. Now let's talk about species extinction. What do I mean by species extinction? You've probably heard of endangered species and so forth. Species extinction is when we have the disappearance or dying out of a particular breed of plant, animal, or other organism. Of course, when we're dealing with species extinction, we all think of animals, mostly exotic animals. How many have ever heard of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF? They have the panda, is their logo. Well, actually, the panda has made a recovery. It's no longer critically endangered. There's other species that are critically endangered. But species extinction is the disappearance or dying out of a particular breed of plant, animal, or other organism. All right. Again, as we're dealing with environmental issues, we have to be on the lookout for extremism and environmentalist bias. The Earth stands on the brink of its sixth mass extinction, and the fault is ours. What do you see in that statement? You see those tactics. We are blaming the wrong cause. We are predicting alarming results, and so forth. Do all scientists agree with this statement? No. All right. Species extinction in particular is based on evolutionary assumption. And this is kind of odd, because according to evolution, what should species be doing? What's one of the main tenets of evolution? Survival of the fittest. Isn't the idea of extinction part of evolution? So then why are we trying to interfere with evolution if we're an evolutionist? So this is kind of backwards even for evolutionary philosophy. Uses faulty statistical techniques. Okay, I've got things that I've printed off here dealing with mass extinction underway, majority of biologists say, Washington Post. Okay. A majority of the nation's biologists are convinced that a mass extinction of plants and animals is underway that poses a major threat to humans in the next century. Yet most Americans are only dimly aware of this problem. Okay, let me keep reading. What are you hearing? Are you hearing bias? Are you hearing appeal to scientific consensus? Are you hearing an overstatement of the consequences? Are you hearing the prediction of dire consequences? Are you thinking about those four tactics? You need to be. Okay? The next paragraph starts this way. The rapid disappearance of species was ranked as one of the planet's gravest environmental worries, surpassing pollution, global warming, and the thinning of the ozone layer. According to the survey of 400 scientists commissioned by New York's American Museum of Natural History. 400 scientists. I don't know about this particular poll or survey, but I do know many times they will poll scientists that are not biologists, are not meteorologists. Okay, so who were these 400 scientists? I like to throw the word scientist around. It says the polls released yesterday comes on the heels of a groundbreaking study of plant diversity that concluded that at least 1 in 8 known plant species is threatened with extinction. Here is some more. It says, it gives it scientists who have participated in the survey. It says the speed at which species are being lost is much faster than any we've seen in the past, including those extinctions related to meteor collisions. The last mass extinction caused by a meteor collision was that of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Most of his peers apparently agree. Nearly 7 out of 10 biologists polled said they believed a mass extinction was underway. And an equal number predicted that up to 1/5 of all living species could disappear within 30 years. Is that true? Oh, I didn't tell you the date on this, did I? You ready? April 21st, 1998. How many years ago? Almost 20. Are we at the point of 1/5 of all living species disappearing within 30 years? No. Where do they get their statistics? How do they derive those numbers? They throw numbers around, like one particular place I read was talking about the rate of extinction is 10,000 times greater than it should be with the normal background extinction. In other words, if there were no people. Where do they get those numbers? Okay. Faulty statistical techniques. I would really like to know how they come up with some of their answers. It seems like they pull it out of the air. I'm not saying that they do, but I do know that they are predicting dire consequences. And I do know they choose their data selectively. All right, does anybody know what type of animal is the most numerous as far as the number of different species identified? And what kind of animals are constantly, we're discovering new species of this type? Would it be mammals? No. Fish, birds, what kind of animals? Insects. Okay. So what happens then if we include every little tiny different subdivision called subspecies of insect in our species calculations? It's going to look a whole lot worse, isn't it? But when we are dealing with our species extinction, do we put photographs of insects on the internet? No. What do we put photographs of? Panda bears, polar bears, tigers, okay, gorillas, rhinos. Are those animals in dwindling numbers? Yes, they are. But a lot of it is not due to the environment, it's due to illegal poaching and things like that. So selective data is one way that you can manipulate your facts by selecting certain things. And then you give the appearance of something else, even though your data didn't really include, and so forth. All right? Causes of species extinction. Causes of species extinction, of course, is human behavior. What happened to survival of the species? What happened to evolution, weeding out weaker species, and so forth? We are destroying habitats on a daily basis. Okay? Remember, some environmentalists view us as a blight on the earth, or even use the word infection. You and I are infecting the earth. That's very pantheistic when we're viewing the earth as a person. All right, and of course we're going to destroy habitats by pollution, deforestation, agriculture. After all, we have to feed our 7.5 billion people. Urbanization, and of course, climate change. Climate change is being blamed right now as the #1 culprit. And of course, that comes back on us as well because we are the cause of climate change. I showed you this picture last time. We deal with climate change. Anytime we talk about climate change, I have to show you a polar bear. Polar bears are not critically endangered. They are on the list further down. But we don't have polar bears going extinct because the ice caps are melting. So species extinction. Remember I said it's got an environmental bias and it has an evolutionary bias. Ecosystem took millions of years to perfect, are in danger when any species is declining. And the catastrophic impact of the loss of biodiversity is likely to affect the planet for millions of years to come. Remember, we don't give God any credit as creator. And so it's taken us millions of years to develop our ecosystems, and we're going to destroy them in a matter of a few centuries. All right, here's that tactic again. We're predicting dire results. We're using the word planetary emergency. We're using the word catastrophic. We're using all kinds of extreme words. So what happens when a species becomes extinct? Well, it can throw the whole ecosystem out of balance. Food chain disruption, loss of biodiversity. Those are the results of species extinction. Can there be an imbalance? Can we have a problem with natural processes? How many have ever heard of a problem with pollination because of smaller bee populations? Can that be a problem? Yes, but it is local. Can we fix that problem? Probably relatively easy. Start breeding bees and releasing them. Okay, but is that a planetary emergency? No. So I'm not saying that we want to, slaughter animals randomly, and I'm not saying that we should be for poaching in Africa, destroying a lot of the ecosystems there. I'm not saying that at all, but what I'm saying is it's out of balance. Endangered species. Is it too late? Are gorillas going to disappear off the face of the earth? You can see in the top right-hand corner, that's one of the most endangered species. That is a particular type of leopard found in Southeast Asia. Then we have the black rhino, also critically endangered species, and the orangutan. Some subspecies of orangutan are becoming critically endangered. Gorillas are critically endangered, I mentioned, and so forth. Top 10 endangered species. This is from the World Wildlife Fund for 2017. The first one, does anybody know what that is? Do you notice it's got a Spanish-sounding looking name, right? That's a type of dolphin. Sometimes it's called the desert dolphin. It is a very small subspecies of dolphin. In fact, its habitat is just off the coast of California and that portion of Mexico. Are we going to have catastrophic planetary emergency if this species disappears? No. There's the leopard that I had a picture of. It's number 2. There's a particular rhino species that's even more endangered than the black rhino, lemur. That's that cute bear, kind of a looking halfway monkey, halfway looking bear with the big eyes. Okay. Lowland gorilla, the saula. That is a kind of looks like an antelope and a deer mixed together. That's a mammal that's also critically endangered. Leatherback sea turtle, South China tiger, Chinese giant salamander, ivory-billed woodpecker. Most of those animals that you saw in the pictures and so forth are African exotic species. Not that we want to see any one species disappear off the earth and so forth, but this is not a planetary emergency. It's not going to result in the loss of biodiversity. That makes it sound like we're going to be losing all these animals and ecosystems are going to disappear and so forth. Simply not the case. Biblical view of biodiversity. Is the earth diverse? Yes. Keep in mind, who gave us biodiversity? God did. And He placed the potential for variation within the original creation, didn't He? How many different animals do you think were on the ark? when we're talking about biodiversity, we have to realize that species is a biology term, not a biblical term, and it is much, much more specific than the Bible kinds introduced in Genesis chapter 1. Think about the so-called dog kind. How many different species of dog are there? How many different varieties in just that one type of animal? Where did all that variety come from? Where did all the variety, even in this room, come from? From our genetic makeup. Where was all that variety? What's the source of all that variety? God programmed our DNA that way. So God created biodiversity. He placed all of that variation, that infinite variation, in the original creation. We even know that on the ark, we didn't need to have every single species on the ark. We just needed to have the main kinds of animals. And if you're familiar with taxonomy, you probably learned kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Species being one of the smallest categories, and even some of these animals that I mentioned are subspecies. All right, so we've subdivided. Most likely, the Bible kind is way up at the family level. So we're having extinctions occurring down here at the species level, but that doesn't mean that we're going to lose the biodiversity. God programmed animal DNA, plant DNA, with a lot of diversity. So we don't have to worry about an extinction of some subspecies in Africa, do we? No. But again, that doesn't mean also that we're all in favor of poaching of elephants for their tusks. What is that? That's greed and materialism. So I'm not saying that God is for all these things. Obviously, he's not. And God does maintain biodiversity. Do animals adapt to their environment? Yes. We mentioned survival of the fittest as being an evolutionary tenet, and it is. But it's also part of how God designed animals. We have immense variety in the animal kingdom, and I'm not even mentioning plants. Plants are a part of the ecosystem as well. But all of these things were designed by God with immense variety. And there's no way extinction of several species, even several hundred species, is going to change the biodiversity that God designed and put on the earth. Community. What is the community? Remember the definition? We had two main definitions, community and habitat. I've been using habitat a lot in these lectures. I haven't been using community so much. Remember, community is all the living things that live together. Habitat, of course, is the place where the community lives. It's the place where a particular animal or plant lives, grows, and thrives. So what is a biblical view of community, or the organisms that all live together? It's a direct reflection of God's infinite diversity. So loss of biodiversity is not something that's going to happen when we think about God and we think about him as creator, and we think about how well designed the earth is, how well designed living things are, and the immense potential for variety that there is. And remember, God created different kinds of animals. The word kind is in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1. 10 times Genesis chapter 1 repeats the phrase after his kind, or after its kind, or after their kind. So God created species with these different kinds programmed into their DNA. You've probably seen the word baramim, or however you might pronounce it. And that is not a biblical word. That is a word that we've kind of coined as creationists, scientists. And that takes two Hebrew words, bara, which means create or bring into existence, and then min, which means, and is translated in Genesis 1 as kind. So if we put those two together, we get the idea of a created kind. All right, did God create at the species level? No, it's a higher level than that. How long would it have taken Adam to name all the species? And it didn't take him very much time because he only named the major groups. He didn't name all the different varieties within each group. So created kind is a much larger category than today's biology species. And again, many of those endangered species are actually even below that. They're subspecies. All right, so what about species extinction? Well, how do you view it? You shouldn't view it. You should view it as just another environmental issue that's blown out of proportion, that is not something that is high on our priority list. I think the first thing that I want you to realize is that extinction is part of what? Genesis chapter 3. We know about the fall of Adam, and we know the major changes that took place. Do those changes just affect humanity? No, those changes also affect the entire earth. And of course, that would include the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. So keep in mind that, yes, God created biodiversity and God created a perfect earth, but we, in one sense, some of this is our fault, okay, because of the curse of sin and the results of sin. All right, so with species extinction, we have to look out for that environmental bias. And I added the word propaganda. Okay, when I went through this with similar slide with resource depletion. There is an environmental bias also with this issue. And they're off balance. They're out of balance. They're alarmist, extremist, and much of it is propaganda. Propaganda, of course, has the idea of it having an agenda behind it, doesn't it? And the idea that it is blown out of proportion. That's what propaganda is. So when you're looking at environmental issues and you're thinking about things like this, they need to be relatively low on your priority list. Okay? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be informed about them and realize what's going on. Okay? The same 4 tactics are being used. And remember, you have to, as you go through your life, you need to read with discernment, right? You need to listen to news reports with discernment. You need to think about what's going on around you with discernment and discretion. So when you're thinking about and looking at environmental issues, be aware of the environmentalist bias. Be aware of the fact that most of it, much of it at least, is propaganda. Be on the lookout. Be suspicious of what you read with respect to environmental issues. Be aware of what those 4 tactics are used and what's going on. Last, environmental solutions. Remember, in our 4 tactics, number 3, we talk about blaming the wrong causes. Here are the 3 main culprits of environmental problems. Number 1 is number 1 on purpose, overpopulation. Next to that, I want you to write down third world countries. Population is a problem. Environmentalists want to pinpoint and target overpopulation in your underdeveloped third world type countries. So when we blame environmental issues on overpopulation, we're not really looking at the United States. Overconsumption. Oh, next to that one, that's us. Okay? The United States and other, we are really bad with this. Even the Europeans look down their noses at us. We have gas-guzzling cars. And actually, I did read a statistic that says that the average American consumes more, whether it's fossil fuels, food, energy, whatever, as much as every American consumes as much as 30 people in Africa. I think I can probably believe that one. So overconsumption is how we're blamed, and then industry is how developed countries, which includes the United States, Canada, Europe, and so forth, is the causes of environmental issues. So there's our 3 solutions that go along with those 3 problems. Decrease global population is a major goal of environmentalists, and their idea is to achieve 0 population growth. Now, that's not going to happen. That would require dire genocide and abortion and infanticide and so forth. But it is still promoted as a goal, 0 population growth globally. Then we need to limit consumption in the United States especially. How are we going to do that? Production and price controls. Taxation. How many have ever heard of a sin tax? It's kind of funny they still call it that. That's where you tax alcohol and you tax cigarettes. Why? To make them more expensive so that less people smoke and so forth. That's just an example. And then the regulation of industry in industrialized nations. Put pollution controls and resource controls on industry. Are those appropriate? The answer is no. Here's those 3 ideas. Obviously, we can't go into detail on all the different things that can be done, but all of them fall into those categories. Conservation. I borrowed and added to, reduce, reuse, recycle. Well, yeah, let's do that. There's nothing wrong with reducing our consumption and reusing things. That's just stewardship. Recycling, replanting, replacing, those are good things. Replacing and so forth. Responsibility, remember? Also stewardship. Who owns the earth? How should we treat the animal kingdom? How do we treat things like this as being God's property? And then innovation, research and development. Conservation, I think, has the idea of wise management. Do we have these things in place? Yes. Should we put some of these things into place? Yes, but these are local issues and there should be local solutions. Water conservation. Should we be designing water reservoirs and more efficient ways to deliver clean water? Yes, those are good things. But this isn't what we're not talking about controlling population and mandating family size and promoting abortion. Those are wrong solutions, and that's many times the solutions proposed by environmentalists. The whole problem goes back to overpopulation, according to them. We need to promote birth control. We need to promote abortion and so on and so forth. Well, we don't need those solutions. We can do things on a local scale like we are already doing. Water conservation, soil conservation. Didn't God put laws into place for soil conservation? Didn't God have rotation of crops, right? If you study the law in the Old Testament about having rotating crops and every 7th year leaving the ground alone, God already put those things into place. Forest conservation, wildlife conservation. Yeah, let's have some conservation parks where we protect animals. That's fine. Let's have zoos. Oh, that's another controversy. More and more people are appalled at zoos. Responsibility. Should we be careful about exhaust and so forth in industry? Yes. Should we dump stuff into Lake Michigan? No. So we do need to control things like that. We need to have proper waste disposal. And we should use recycled materials, but all of these would come down to the third, and that is innovation. We should be researching better ways to control population and filter exhaust, better ways to reuse things. We should be coming up with ways to reuse and recycle and so forth. Should we work on making more efficient light bulbs and more efficient appliances? Sure, that's a good thing. So we want to push for newer, better technology, not population control, not taxation. Energy efficient engines, solar powered devices, renewable energy. Those are all appropriate solutions. We need to be freeing industry up so that they have the money to invest in new technology, not stifle their production and overtax and overregulate. Those are inappropriate solutions. All right, so there's our nice picture to end the lecture. I'll see you on Thursday.